You know, I've taught a lot of students English, and there's one thing that surprises all of them: the value of mastering your tongue, and more importantly, opening your ears. Do you have trouble speaking? Do you have trouble understanding fast, natural speech? Maybe you have trouble remembering vocabulary words because you keep mixing up the sounds or maybe the stress pattern. Pronunciation and ear training is the one key solution to all of those problems. In fact, if we look over here, language learning is composed of 5 skills and 2 what I call knowledge areas, because it's just about facts. The 5 skills are pronunciation, which includes ear training, right here. We have listening, of course, speaking, reading, writing. These are the 4 skills that you normally think of, but pronunciation and ear training is also a skill. The 2 knowledge areas include vocabulary and grammar. Now, vocabulary is a knowledge area because it's just words and maybe phrases. So either this word means this or it doesn't. Grammar, which is usually a big focus in traditional classes, is really just a description of a language, and it's not the language itself. So this is where you want to be, and you probably know that, especially if you've seen a lot of my other videos. But this pronunciation and ear training is so critically important, and in fact, it will help almost all of the other areas. It'll help your listening skills, of course, because if you open your ears to hear the sounds and to hear the rhythm, then you will better be able to understand natural spoken speech at fast speed. In fact, there are probably sounds that you can't even hear, because when you were a baby, when you were first born, your brain had the ability to hear every sound that a human could make. Over time, in the first 6 months to a year or so, it focused on hearing the sounds of your native language, and it started focusing just on getting those and starting to be able to try to produce those sounds. And you don't remember any of that because you were a baby. But you played with the sounds, and you focused on hearing and separating out the sounds and how they flow and how they connect. And that is all that pronunciation and ear training is about. That's all it is. There's a lot of information, but it's actually not that bad, and it can even be really fun. So going back here, of course it can help your speaking by allowing you to speak more clearly, more naturally, and help you speak faster if you want to. There are times when we want to enunciate and speak more clearly, and then there are times, especially in informal situations, when you want to speak more quickly and you don't have to be as clear. You might not think that pronunciation and ear training would help your reading skills, but if you'll notice, if you're like most people, when you read, you probably hear a voice in your head. And if you're reading English, you're going to hear your own accent, right? And so reading is very, very good. In fact, it's one of the best ways to expand your vocabulary, among other things. But if all the time that you're reading, you're constantly hearing your own accent in your head, you're just reinforcing bad pronunciation, bad listening skills, of how your brain thinks words are pronounced and how English flows. Now, writing, not as big of an impact there, but again, usually when you're writing, you'll sort of think the thoughts and they'll be in your accent as you write. So it does have an impact there as well. With vocabulary, very often what happens is you'll hear a new word, or you'll find a new word, and maybe you're trying to review the word and you're doing spaced repetition, or some sort of review method where you have to maybe see the word in your language and think of the English word. And maybe there's two words that are kind of similar. For example, maybe the word cat and cut. And you can't quite remember which one was the proper pronunciation. So it can definitely help vocabulary with that. And in addition, throughout this course, I'm going to give you common spelling patterns because English has a very horrible spelling system, as you probably know. And so that will actually allow you to remember how a word is spelled much more easily, but we have to go through all of that information first. A lot of the time, grammar words, as we'll talk about later, for example, to, you expect this to be pronounced with an oo, to. For example, I want to go to the beach. Now, to and also these will almost always reduce in sound and become t and the. And they're these short little reduction sounds. That's called a schwa, which we'll talk about later in the course. But you're expecting to and the, and you might not even catch the word. So it can actually help your grammar because when you're listening and you're getting exposure to English, you can actually start to recognize those words where, as if I say, I want to go to the beach, maybe you don't hear one of those. And in fact, want to, as you probably know, becomes wanna. That's a very common thing. And it's not necessarily informal, it's just part of how we speak. So in that case, there's not even a T there. And notice the from t actually remains. We spell it with an A if we write that, but wanna. So you can imagine the impact that this would have potentially on your grammar because you're actually able to hear the little words and changes that are there that you might not notice without this training. So that is the core of why pronunciation and ear training is so very important. And you might not be interested in having a perfect accent. That's fine. You don't have to. If you really want to, it is possible for almost any person at any age learning any language to sound either like a native or very close to a native. Some things might be harder to get than others. That depends on you, your native language, so you might need more practice for certain sounds or for certain areas. But generally speaking, you can go as far as you want, all the way up to sounding like a native. But the other side of this is, let's say you're not interested in having really, really good pronunciation. You just want to be understandable. I have a lot of students who they don't care if they don't sound like a native or close to a native, and that's perfectly fine. But this right here is perhaps the main key. Ear training. See, because pronunciation has two areas. We have the production, which is your mouth, and your tongue, your lips, your throat, all those parts. And then we have the reception, which is your ears. And as I said, there might be certain sounds in English that you don't even hear because when you were a baby, your brain didn't need that sound. A very common example of this would be eat and it. Most English learners pronounce these words the same. They are not pronounced the same. This sound, which in this case is spelled E-A, it's just spelling. This is the E sound, E, which many languages have. This is the E sound. So E, 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 e. You might hear a difference side by side. You might not hear any difference at all. If you can, good job. But then throw that into the flow of natural speech, might be a little harder. That's just one very, very common example of a sound that might not exist in your language, and so you actually don't even hear it. You don't notice it. Now, lastly, and we're going to talk about this in depth in the next video, when we talk about the core concepts and terms or words that we will need. But we have rhythm and intonation. Rhythm is basically the flow. So when I say, I want to go to the beach, there's a certain sort of music to that. Very short, simple explanation there. Basic sounds are, like we were just talking about, e, a, those are vowels, or o, u. We have consonant sounds. We'll talk about that next time. That's like t, l, all those sounds. So those are the basic individual sounds. And then lastly, we have connections or linking. And that's like when we saw want to becomes wanna. That's an example of linking. And in this case, the T just completely disappears. Sometimes that happens. Other times something else might happen. If we say like it, we don't say these like it. We don't do that. We say like it. Like it. So that's another example of connections or linking. And this is also another very good example of why, whether it's pronunciation or ear training or both, this is so important for you, because if you're not aware of that, it's going to be a lot harder to hear that in natural, fast speech. If I say, oh no, I really like it. Oh no, I really like it. Right? I said, oh no, I really like it. See, I slow it down, you can understand. When I speak quickly, maybe not. So we're going to go over all that. We're going to open your ears. We're going to allow you to master your mouth and how to produce these sounds if you choose to do so. But one final point before we go that I think is very important to mention, coming back here, you might notice that if this is so important, especially the ear training part, the reception part, if this is so important, why hasn't anybody told you about this? Well, in traditional classes, in a classroom, if you go to school, if this is sort of the basis of language that can help all the other areas, but traditional classes focus a lot here and a lot here, they're kind of doing it backwards. Now, there's no one right way to learn a language. I wrote a whole book about how to build your own language learning path. However, especially in a language like English, where the spelling system is just not reflective of the actual sounds, because there's so many exceptions, and I'm sure you guys know all about that. But when you were a kid, right, and you don't have to learn naturally, but when you were a kid and you were growing up, right, as I said, your brain started focusing, okay, what are the sounds I need? And how do I start making those sounds? And when babies babble, when they go, they make all their little sounds. That's called babbling. They're practicing this. They're practicing both of these. So you did that as a baby in your native language. You got to do it again. Later, after pronunciation, right, you spent a lot of time listening for your first 3 or 4 years. You started speaking and trying to produce the language, right? You had lots of exposure to the grammar through your listening. You learned lots of words through interaction with people around you. And so it was very organic and very natural. So it's sort of pronunciation, ear training, listening and speaking, vocabulary and grammar, those all kind of went together. Of course, this continues on through school, so you can learn more specific things and learn how to write properly and all that stuff. But the reading and writing, you didn't start doing that until you were 4, 5, 6, depending. So it's backwards, right? They do it this way, kind of, minus that. And then way too much of this. So it's kind of like that. And this is why you're here watching this video instead of, out having very nice conversations and being able to understand everything and express yourself fully in English. That is why you should open your ears and/or learn to master your mouth. As we go through this course, we're going to go through all of this and more. There is quite a lot of information, so we'll go through step by step, video by video. Just keep going along with the course and you'll start making really excellent progress. So if you have any questions or comments, leave them down below. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the little bell icon so that you never miss a video in this course or any other English Hacks videos. And I will see you guys in the next one.